with history of Mexico. Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dee Dee. It's good to see you all again. And it was interesting timing. If you get the, is it the Ojo del Lago, or what's this the name of the? Ojo del Lago. They have a column on the streets of Mexico. And this month is on the Adelitas, which we talked about yesterday. And yeah, it's pretty well done. It's David Ellison writes that. Yeah. So pick up your copy. And so I wanted to start today with a little guessing game. So I'm going to ask Fernanda to bring up the first slide, and if you can tell me who this young man is. Somebody knows. Do you all know? Yeah, okay. And it's revealed in the next slide, if you don't know. Yeah, that's Frida with her family portrait. You know, her father was a photographer from Germany. And so here she is in like 1924, I believe, confident and cross-dressing and just doing just as she pleases. It's just, I think, a remarkable snapshot of the freedom that she experienced, and of course her family was part of that. Her father was very supportive of her creativity and had a great influence on her. And so her life, I think, represents, you know, it's iconic in its own right. You know, we have these iconic women in Mexican history. And actually, Dee Dee and I have a great history of that, too, because we are together with a friend who wrote a wonderful play on the 8 outstanding women in Mexican history. And I got to be the narrator. You know, I couldn't be in it, but the 8 women were wonderfully portrayed. It was by a local playwright, Rosangelica Moreno, in Puerto Vallarta, who's Mexican-American, kind of has dual identity, dual citizenship. Very fascinating woman with her own story. But when we searched for someone to fulfill the role of Frida Kahlo, we had to look far and wide till we found the perfect person. And who would that have been? Anybody have any ideas who we could have found to portray Frida, other than Larry? Would you like to take a bow, Frida? And let me tell you, she was stunning. And do we have photos of that? I'm sure you do somewhere.
I do.
You should bring them Saturday, and maybe.
Oh, that's a good
yeah.
idea.
I mean, what a Frida. And yeah, and you know, each woman came out in this perfect dress, you know, her period costume and everything that Rose and Helica went to great lengths to create, and they had a narration. I helped Rose and Helica a little bit with the historical part. She's a very good historian too. So it's a play that would be worth bringing to Ajijic, wouldn't it?
It really would. Can I just tell you, the best part of the play was Rosa Angelica, the woman who wrote the whole thing. When it came to the topic of the Adelitas, she came riding on the stage on horseback with the whole audience singing the song Adelita, and I was really impressed.
She made quite an entrance, and she had the bundle, the pistolas and the, So, you know, I think it's wonderful to study history, but also to celebrate it and to celebrate its amazing features. So, the other thing that I wanted to come back to from a mention yesterday of this wonderful Como Agua para Chocolate, it started as a book, Laura Esquivel, and then there was a movie made in the 80s, which is quite good, and then just in the last couple of years, HBO came out with a series. Has anyone seen the series? It's It's wonderful. And so I'm going to show you the trailer, because not only does it capture, the movie is set in the time of the Mexican Revolution that we spoke about yesterday. And it's set in a hacienda in the north of Mexico, at the very center of the turmoil. And there's a woman who runs the hacienda, and I'm trying to remember what happened to her husband. It wasn't a, it's a tragic story. It's filled with tragedy. But she runs at the mother with an iron fist, as you'll indicate somewhat. And she's got several daughters. She's trying to marry off the eldest daughter. But the Prince Charming is in love with the other daughter, who is the cook, the magic cook. And each episode and each chapter in the book starts with a recipe, an actual Mexican traditional recipe with all the ingredients. And every episode circles around a meal. And it's a truly brilliant work. But it not only captures the times of the revolution, which we've spoken about a bit, but also when we go back to the first days, when we talked about how women were often accused of witchcraft with chocolate brewing and other food, because they had their sphere of power was the domestic sphere, and so they could be, that was also a place that men would fear their power, you know, that the women could enchant them with the food. And so that comes back into this story as well. So I thought we'd watch the trailer, which is our first video, Fernanda. I think it's the next slide, right? Yeah. So you can go ahead and start that.
Ponle 2 cucharadas de nata. Suave, lo suave, que se mezcle bien. ¿Para quién estás cocinando estas torrejas?
Estas torrejas me están volviendo loco.
Pedro te ama, tita.
¿Tú cómo sabes?
Pues porque me he dado cuenta cómo se la come a besos con la mirada.
¿Me aconsejas este baile?
Vinieron a pedir la mano de Tita. Y sí, habrá boda. Pero como les expliqué a ellos, hace tiempo que decidí que Tita se va a quedar a cuidarme en esta casa hasta que me muera.
¿Qué está diciendo, mami?
Que Pedro Musqui se va a casar con Rosaura.
Sin tu cariño.
Yo sé que un día vamos a ser muy felices juntos.
Voy caminando.
Usted de verdad es mi mamá. Porque es extraño que siendo mi mamá me trate en el modo en el que me trata.
Basta.
Porque siempre busca hacerme daño. ¿Qué le hice yo para que...
¡Basta, Tita! ¡Cállate!
Pedro no es solo tuyo, Tita.
¡Basta! ¡Basta ya!
No dejes que tu familia te haga lo mismo que a mí. No dejes que nadie te diga a quién puedes amar.
Deja que
Provecho.
yo te busque. Y si te encuentro.
Tiene demasiada sal. Voy a tomar aire.
Olvida lo pasado. Ya no te acuerdes de
Ingrata.
Si quieres cambiar al mundo, tiene que empezar por algo, ¿no? Cambiar al mundo.
ya no te acuerdes.
Espérate, me tienes que escuchar.
Ya te escuché y me dijiste puras mentiras.
Nunca te mentí.
Que me amabas, que te ibas a casar conmigo. Nada de eso fue verdad.
De aquí la que
Tal vez algún día podamos estar juntos. Tal vez algún día podamos tener la vida que queremos.
Tal vez.
Wow, huh? So that's definitely going to be worth a look. So coming out of the revolution, there's a couple of movements I wanted to cover today. And the first one, if you bring up the next slide, Fernanda, Sex and Revolution, which of course has that cover, talking about Frida. And then the next slide after that, we get into campaigns of to control and regulate prostitution, public health, hygiene. There was a eugenics movement I spoke about earlier. And it's centered around also sexually transmitted diseases. So part of the notion of coming out of the revolution is that we could now create a scientifically planned society, you know. Socialist economies tend to be planned economies, and that's the vision of socialist economy is we have to plan everything, and part of that is structuring how we handle public health. And so prostitution became an area of where women's bodies were being regulated under the guise of science. And what we find is that the reformers, for instance, used syphilis. If we can go to the next slide, I think we have some images. Next slide, yeah. Of there were beginning to get new breakthroughs on syphilis, but it was used as a vehicle for kind of a state intervention into citizens' private lives by framing sexual behavior as a public health issue requiring scientific solutions. And, the reformers could justify these comprehensive programs targeting primarily working class women while largely exempting men from similar scrutiny, okay? So it was a science of redemption sort of thing, established new forms of state authority that fundamentally altered the relationship between the government and the citizens, in particular in matters of sexuality, family life, and moral behavior. So it's hard to imagine, but the extent and the reach of the government into the lives of the people, but it was a very sort of paternalistic approach that comes out of the revolution. And you can still see echoes of that paternalism in the way that the healthcare system is run today. I don't know if you've been, encountered the Mexican healthcare system up close or been involved in it in terms of the way that patients are sort of managed. It's, in some ways, it's very comforting because you're kind of taken care of in a way that it's rather unusual. I know of centers where, for instance, the government has taken a very aggressive and I think laudable stance trying to control HIV. And so they've got centers around the country in a program called Capacites, which is if you have HIV and sign up there, they provide everything from medical checks to psychological care, dental care, it goes on, the list goes on, nutrition, and, they kind of ask, it's a very holistic approach to health. And I have to say, even on the limited resources that are sometimes available, even the IMSS system, which is the National Medical Healthcare System, it's strapped on resources, but I've kind of shepherded some friends through medical issues, and so I've gotten to know the system a little bit up close. And you'll never be asked for a peso. That's the nice thing. The medicines and everything is provided. So the government took this kind of approach towards healthcare, which is laudable, but at the same time, I think the restrictive nature, the impact on women's freedom and life, in a way, it was another attempt after the revolution to kind of put everything back in the box. We had these women on the battlefield, we saw them. We saw the flappers yesterday, with the, sexual liberation of the 20s, or the new sense of freedom for women. And there was a reaction to that, and I think this can be seen as part of the reaction to kind of keep women domesticated, control the sexual behavior, all under the gauze of science and a redemption of syphilis and, a moral reformation. There was quite a bit of moralizing going on in government circles at this time. So women were, in a sense, viewed as redeemable through state intervention if they had, gone on the wayward path, for instance, while men were considered naturally promiscuous. And so I just think it's an interesting snapshot of some of the gender attitudes there. And I think I have another slide on that as well. Yeah. And, but it kind of leads us into machismo. And so we can move forward another slide. And from the golden age of cinema, is that Pedro Infante, the Mexican hero, but all the women adoring him. But, we associate this term with Mexican masculinity in particular, but I was interested when I started looking it up that it actually emerged first in English language scholarship in the 1940s to 1960s as sort of what we could call an ethnic construction of hypermasculinity applied to Latinos by Anglos. And so at least the researchers I've looked at argue that the use of machismo enabled kind of a pathologizing of Latin American masculinity, like there's something, an illness, like there's something wrong with Mexican men. They've got this, they're afflicted with machismo, no? Like as if it was some sort of different kind of masculinity or expression. And interestingly, it's the term's rise coincided with the Cold War anxieties about hemispheric security, immigration, overpopulation. So we're talking in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Because Mexican sources, when we look at like Octavio Paz and some of the other writers, didn't actually use the term machismo in their early works. It was very limited use into the 1930s. But in the US scholarly world, it began to be adopted and used in studies of Mexico and Puerto Rico that were largely driven by Cold War area studies, of the concern of keeping an eye on Latin America, which was quite a big concern in Washington in the era of competition with the Soviet Union for the hearts and minds of the third world, as it was called, or we would say the developing world. So you get researchers like Oscar Lewis is a famous researcher you may have heard of. But their mythology had a lot of problems. They relied on vague observations rather than any kind of real empirical data. And they kind of had self-fulfilling research that found what they expected to find when they looked for machismo. They linked machismo, interestingly, to kind of a susceptibility to communist subversion. They thought, well, this is where the communists are going to take control because their men are, the macho man isn't capable of leadership. It was connected to fears of Latin America, quote, overpopulation, and blamed for inhibiting birth control efforts that were being promoted by the U.S. The U.S. exported a lot of birth control in this era. And it was also used in criticizing Mexican and Puerto Rican communities in the U.S. And it kind of reinforced a racialized perception of Latin American men as threatening dark-skinned men as a kind of a trope or a, ongoing stereotype. And actually, this researcher goes back to, remember the TV series Ironside? Was it with Perry Mason? Yeah, right? There's an episode in 1969 called the Machismo Bag, when it marks the mainstream entrance of the term in popular usage. In this episode, which was I think about a violent death, a gender-based death, but they used the episode in the courtroom to kind of explain what this machismo was. And they began to apply it also to the radicals of the 60s, the protesters, as both Latino, Chicano, and also Anglo. It's kind of a negative masculinity that's run amok among the younger generation. It has a lot of limitations, though, and I think what the researchers I've looked at just want to point out is that it's a conceptualization of hypermasculinity that's presumed to be, derived from the Iberian, which would be the Spanish, or Portuguese, the Iberian Peninsula, derived from Iberian and Latin American cultural essences. It's applied by Anglophone scholars and popular authorities since the 50s to kind of flag or admonish or deride, hypermasculinity. And so it's a term that kind of came into popular usage as a way to sort of say, well, Mexicans have some sort of a heightened sense of it's kind of in their blood or in some way, or it's got to be in their genes or in their culture, kind of setting them apart. And I just wanted to point that out because up until, looking into it, I assumed it kind of came out of the Mexican culture, this term originally, Now, it's in popular usage today to explain all sorts of gender-based violence, and I'm going to show you some pretty graphic examples of that, but I just wanted to, mention that it actually was the Anglos who began to use that term. Yeah, we have a question in the back. Do we have a microphone for them?
Since you mentioned the 1950s, can you say something about the zoot suit? I think that was from the 1920s, wasn't it? Going on in the United States, that was part of the stereotype of Hispanic people, wasn't it? The zoot suit type of era was not. Was it black culture? I thought it was. I thought it was Hispanic.
Zoot suit is a Latino term. I mean, it was applied to, I think, early Chicano identity, but I'm not real familiar with how it emerged. My guess would be that this was the era where the migrant communities were flourishing, between, really before the 1960s, there was a pretty porous border. And of course, we had a Bracero program, which was a regulated, work visa program for Mexicans who were brought to work in the agricultural fields. And so, as I recall, it's kind of an elaborate dressing up, right? So I think it might have something to do with, being stylized for acceptance purposes in the larger culture, kind of respect, But it's an interesting question. I don't know. It doesn't strike me as a particularly overly macho expression of Latino masculinity, but other impressions in the U.S. about, growing up, I know that Latinos, Hispanics were always portrayed in my Anglo area as somewhat threatening and, kind of dangerous people. And I also noticed that to this day, any gringo or American or Canadian or any foreign expat who suffers any kind of violence in Mexico, it'll be front page news back home somewhere, you know, whereas there may be 10 local murders, 10 local murders in that community, you know, but it's just kind of part of the dynamic of, yeah.
I was raised in Southern California, so I'm also curious about the stereotype of the lowriders, where cars were really outstandingly upgraded for display, and the seeming marriage between masculinity and cars.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
do you have anything to say about that weirdness? I'm sorry, I'm going to call it weirdness. I didn't mean that, but you know, I want to be very accepting of this incredible expression of aesthetic that was going on with the 1956 Chevy. Come on, man, that was a great.
Yes, I remember in high school the hot cars and the peeling out. It was very much a culture, and I think the main point I'd like to suggest is that it isn't, you know, specific to the Latino community. You know, these images of hyper masculinized, masculine identity, and so I have a couple of Mexicans who want to take a crack at explaining machismo to us. They're young. One is a young man and then a young woman. She's a college student talking on a TEDx program. And she's a little nervous and she drops the microphone twice in her talk. So you'll lose her voice suddenly and then they do get it back. But I thought it would be interesting to see their take on this, not only on the term itself, but on the way it limits men, to be trapped in this sort of, expectation of hypermasculinity. So why don't we listen to them for a moment and see what they have to say. Is that coming up next there, Fernanda? Yeah, let's bring this one up.
El pasado 9 de marzo, las mujeres llevaron a cabo en México un paro nacional como protesta a los indignantes niveles de inseguridad que viven en el país por cuestiones de género. Este movimiento, oportuno y definitivamente necesario, nos muestra una unión y convocatoria pocas veces vista en el país, que esperemos represente el inicio de un cambio en la estructura social y que abra conversaciones en todo el país que inviten a la reflexión. Y como todos los conflictos, este tiene un origen histórico, el cual vamos a resumir muy brevemente. Durante la Edad de Piedra, los cazadores-recolectores vivían en sociedades solidarias. En estas sociedades, las mujeres, no una mujer de carácter mitológico, sino cada una de ellas era admirada igual que la tierra por ser origen de vida, madres y protectoras. La feminidad en su conjunto era divina, se les agradecía y se les veneraba. Esto hasta que con el descubrimiento de la agricultura y ya con tierras por proteger, surgen la propiedad privada y las jerarquías. Esta nueva forma de vida empezó a privilegiar a hombres guerreros, sacerdotes y gobernantes y empezó a relegar a la mujer a roles cada vez menos importantes. Pero pasó algo aún más notorio. Los hombres, en su afán de conservar poder, tierras y estatus, empezaron a monopolizar a la mujer imponiendo reglas de castidad, matrimonio, monogamia y disponibilidad reproductiva para asegurar su linaje y heredar posesiones. Así nació el patriarcado. Un patriarcado que se terminó de consolidar con los imperios que imponían reglas de comportamiento y de roles de género al servicio del Estado y con las religiones que inventaron en el matrimonio un contrato en el que la mujer era solamente una transacción que pasaba de ser propiedad del padre a ser propiedad del marido. Todo esto con fines políticos y económicos. Los roles se habían asignado. La mujer se realizaba con el matrimonio y reproduciéndose y el hombre trabajando y siendo un proveedor exitoso. Y así, durante miles de años y con una paz relativa, ambos sexos fueron enseñando y perpetuando los conceptos que hasta nuestros días definen a hombre y mujer en sociedad. Hasta el siglo XX, en el que los países envueltos en dos guerras mundiales que sucedían en pleno apogeo del capitalismo y la industrialización, recurrieron a las mujeres para realizar las tareas de los hombres que se iban a las trincheras. Por primera vez, las mujeres experimentaban la libertad de salir al mundo, tener independencia económica, administrar su dinero al gusto y consumir lo que el mercado tenía para ofrecer. Fue entonces que una vez terminadas las guerras, se negaron con toda razón a volver a la presión de las tareas domésticas y la satisfacción del marido. Se comenzaba a gestar el feminismo como lo conocemos ahora. Y si bien otros países con mejor educación han ido superando esta ideología machista que no tiene ningún fundamento lógico, México tiene impregnado el machismo en lo más profundo de su cultura, en sus canciones, en su televisión pública, en sus leyendas del cine y en los mexicanos como cómplices. Entonces, el enorme terreno que ha ganado la mujer junto con la incapacidad del hombre de despojarse de esta carga histórica ha conducido a una severa crisis de identidad, ya que el machismo en México le prometió al hombre que iba a ser proveedor, pero la mujer ya no lo necesita. Le dijo que iba a tener una pareja segura y estable, pero la mujer ya no se conforma. Le aseguró que iba a ser amo y señor de la casa y la mujer ya no se lo permite. Le garantizó que iba a tener la razón, pero ya son otros tiempos. Y desafortunadamente también el machismo, ante el temor de ver cómo le arrebatan al hombre el único rol social que se le ha enseñado, le enseñó a reaccionar de la forma más primitiva, con violencia en cualquiera de sus presentaciones. La violencia de género en México ha llegado a niveles insostenibles.
In that, after the Mexican Revolution, the attempt to kind of regulate a woman's, what she'd be permitted to do in the family and whether she'd be permitted, look at birth control, the restrictions on it at various levels for women throughout it, the decades. It's still an ongoing struggle in a very big way, isn't it? And I'm not actually sure if women in Mexico can freely receive birth control pills and things with the power of the Catholic Church. I'm not sure how widespread that is or how permitted. I know that part of the rise of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases is that men do not want to be inhibited in any way in their sexuality with such details as condoms and things like that. They consider it, well, if you get pregnant, you get pregnant. You go ahead.
But I don't know the names, but the Catholic priests, I've been told, in the church here have encouraged the use. I don't know her name. There was a woman on the west side of Ajijic, a Mexicana, who did give out birth control and information, and that especially the Anglicans here were quite involved in being supportive of it here, as was at least one time, and I don't know how many years ago this was, within the 15 years I've been here, I was told he openly advocated for Mexican women to get to him.
Interesting, yeah, there's got one in the middle, yeah. Oh.
I know now that DIF provides long-term female contraception injections that last like 5 years and no charge. And I know that years ago in Oaxaca, there were many, the biggest churches were always had banners on them about birth control. It was the people that wanted to not have the church control birth control, because the church tried a lot of things like you can't go to communion or you can't do this or that, but I think that has been rejected by many women and probably men too.
Oh, definitely, yeah. No, clearly it's the shift has taken place, and yeah, it's interesting to hear about DIF, because that's another one of those state agencies with limited resources, and yet they've got this reproductive, this service available, which you're hard-pressed to find in northern countries, I think. Yeah.
Also the public health system I knew of a couple who was not able to get pregnant, and they went through years and years of various treatments and experiments, but it was all paid for by the government, and they had to come from Oaxaca they paid for their transportation, their hotel, because they would have to go frequently, for all these follow-ups. And they paid
Impressive.
for everything, and eventually they had twins.
Oh, great. That's great news. Yeah, thank you for sharing that story. I think the rise of feminism was pointed to, and I've got one more video by a young woman who takes that approach as well to machismo, so this might be a good time to hear from her, a Mexican college student. So let's bring her up, and we'll see how they connect with, the feminist perspective, okay? She does drop the mic a few times.
Do I look good? Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. We are gathered here today because I know everything one needs to know about being a man, about being muy macho. And I know you're looking at me kind of funny. I see it. She's 5'2". What does this Latina have to say? But like most Latinas, I actually have a lot to say. My name is Melissa Carcamo, and thank you for coming to my TED Talk. I am the proud daughter of 2 Nicaraguan parents, and I was born and raised in Miami, Florida. So needless to say, I had a very Hispanic upbringing. But if there's one thing about my culture, is that it really encourages and values hypermasculinity. So as a Latina, it wasn't hard for me to begin identifying what traits defined a man. It was things like avoiding anything feminine, restricting emotionally, seeking achievement and status, frankly being homophobic, and having a detached and rigid sexuality. But I was curious to find out, why are we like this? And I was not surprised to find out that we can trace this back to colonization. I don't want to get super lectury on you guys, but if we're to understand why we are the way that we are now, we have to take a trip back in time. And you see, in early societies, there was always gender and gender roles, but that strict binary and oppression that we have in place today, that came with La Niña, La Pinta, y La Santa Maria. So as a feminist, I could understand that this was traced to colonization, and I saw that when the Spanish essentially invaded Latin America, they brought with them their strict, muy macho patriarchal roles. And our early ancestors had to adopt and adapt these roles for the sake of survival. So then, as a feminist and as a Latina, I saw what it was to be a man, but I realized that wasn't fair. And if my advocacy is for gender equality, that inherently includes men. That includes you. Dare I say, my feminism is pro-men. I said that with a straight face. So feminist theory showed me that the patriarchy and its strict gender roles, it violates, abuses, and rapes trans, non-binary people, women, but it fundamentally robs men of the full human experience. What does that mean? They look fine. I know, I get it. But if we're really to take a look at childhood, and in particular boyhood, we can see that boys are never allowed to be boys. And although the saying is, boys will be boys, that's only ever used in a context when a boy is harassing someone. But other than that, we control what shows they watch, what music they listen to, what colors they wear, what Power Rangers they can play with. We begin to break down the individual identity of this boy for the sake of creating a man. Not an adult, not a person, not a human, a man. And then we create these families that are absent in love, particularly fatherly love. And homes that lack love enable a cycle of harm that is a generational trauma that we are still dealing with from our ancestors. Think about it. ¿Cuántos padres no tienen relaciones con su hijo? ¿Cuántos hermanos no se hablan? ¿Cuántas madres sufren a la mano del abuso doméstico solamente porque no le enseñamos a los varones lo más básico de ser humano? Cómo comunicar y cómo querer. I repeat, how many fathers don't have relationships with their sons? How many brothers don't speak to each other? How many mothers suffer at the hands of domestic abuse only because we couldn't show boys the most basic human skills of how to communicate and how to be loving. We're human. We're social creatures. And if we don't find these things at home, we're bound to seek for these things elsewhere. And this is where we can see the importance of male friendships start taking place. Male friendships provide a source of validation that one is man enough. And it also provides a sense of brotherhood and solidarity. But what I find interesting about these friendships is that they're rarely places where guys can just be open and vulnerable with each other. And part of being human and experiencing all parts of life is having loving and fulfilling friendships. So let's go to adolescence. By this point, boys have gone through pain, but we told them that they couldn't feel it. We traumatized generations of boys, and we didn't let them speak on it. I know that not only girls get depressed and not only girls get sexually assaulted. I know that happens to boys too. But we don't let them talk about it. And I know that mental health is more than just depression. It's eating disorders, it's body image issues, it's PTSD. It's all these things that we never let guys claim. We always just assume that they can handle more pain or that they don't need as much support. But if we are to heal our communities, we need to understand that men's mental health matters. So recap. We broke down the individual identity of this boy. To create a man, we put him in a home that deprived him of love and nurturing, so they had to seek it elsewhere. Then we traumatized them and invalidated their pain. Good. So anyway, and then we get to adulthood, and it's a man. And now, not only did we police their whole upbringing, but now we police their sexuality. We don't let guys explore their sexuality outside of the hetero norm. And this might be groundbreaking, but bi men exist. And not only do they exist, but we don't let men explore their sexuality outside of the hetero norm. We give them two boxes. You're either gay or you're straight. And if you're straight, you constantly have to prove just how straight you are. So all in all, we only gave boys one blueprint on how to become a man. And we did that sacrificing their individual identity to create this man. We committed all these acts of full-blown soul murder to create a man. And then we have the audacity to ask, why are men so cold? It's not biology, it's society. And if we are to heal our community from our ancestors' wounds, we need to create and adopt a new feminist manhood. Now, I know that might be a big and probably if you try to Google it, you wouldn't find anything on it. It's essentially a blank canvas. But I would argue that although that might sound disappointing, a blank canvas is what's working in our favor. We are the generations with the ability to draw out what a new feminist manhood might look like. And I don't want to put it in a box or give you a concrete definition because it would be a disservice to everything we just talked about. Yourself and show yourself some self-care and love. Thank you. And then when you've been able to show yourself love, extend that empathy onto others. Because only when we create a more loving society do we end the cycle of harm. And the cycle of harm doesn't end when you cut off your dad or your brother or that friend. The cycle of harm ends when we all stop harming. Number 2, put yourself before the gender role. Who were you before you had to prove that you were a man? Do some soul searching, and when you find it, nourish it and express it and love it. I know they've been waiting for you. And 3, and I really wish I was Oprah for this one, so I could be like, look under your seat, but it's a TED Talk. So if I had to give you last words, it's to start with a book. For me, feminist theory changed my life. Bell Hooks inspired this speech, but any book would really do, and it's part of the journey. And I plead with you guys that I don't want you to be a feminist because you love your mom, because you have a sister, because you love your girlfriend. Be a feminist because you deserve to be advocated for. You deserve to experience all parts of life, even if that's sadness, happiness, trauma, and healing. You deserve these things solely because you are human. And my final words are to my Latinos, my muy macho Hispanic men. No dejes que el machismo te quite la vida. Feminism doesn't kill, but toxic masculinity kills every day. Thank you.
It's nice to see young folks, speaking so eloquently about these issues, from the ground level where they're experiencing it. It's a Now? Okay. There we go. Reactions to that? Getting in touch with your feminine side and feminists? Here, we got somebody in the back. Yeah.
As a feminist and I raised a feminist daughter who is partnered with a feminist male. And I asked them why they use they, them pronouns, because I respect that, but I didn't quite get it. And basically what they said was exactly what she was talking about. So I think the younger generation, the 20s and 30-year-olds are getting it and doing it.
Okay.
I guess I am a little bit confused because I assume these men are being more machismo with each other in the Mexican community than out for us to see it. Because as a gay man myself, we went to, a few months ago, in Jocotepec, a pageant that was Miss Gay Jocotepec. And the plaza was filled with these families, little kids running around. These young men were on stage in drag, and the whole families were out there celebrating this. And so I'm very confused at where this machismo is coming from. Is it just between the Mexican community and we're not experiencing it, or what? Because I'm a little bit confused, because it seems to be a lot more accepting here than it would be in the United States. I cannot imagine the plaza in the United States having a pageant with these young boys out there in drag and their families and things cheering them on.
Oh, they were young boys in drag? That's interesting. Yeah,
teenagers.
Yeah. No, that's I think it is a good question. I think there are areas that have shown quite an increase in tolerance and acceptance and celebration even. I mean, Puerto Vallarta is like that. I mean, my goodness. We have huge gay parades and things that all sorts of families come out to see. When you get into what we'll see after the break, you'll see the other side, I think. And a lot of it is in the poorer communities around the urban centers like Mexico City and the state of Mexico. There's tremendous male-on-female violence, and people have been kind of ground down by society, and they don't celebrate the same way that you were able to see here. And it's wonderful that it's happening here. But I don't think it's universal. in terms of the acceptance and the kind of embracing of a more open gender identity and things. But I think it's great that I'm hearing that young people, and I do agree that in general, some of the rigid categories of the past have been rejected. But you've got strong reactions, look what's going on in the US. No more drag story time or whatever, even just wiping all mention of things like, gender and equity off of websites and such. So it's definitely a issue that is valenced and has a lot of conflicting. Let's get a microphone to you. Yeah. But thanks for sharing that. That's really nice to hear.
I think a lot of it is very class-based because we have workers showing up at our house. We're still building our home. Their sons all come with them to learn the trades. There's not been one daughter showed up. It's still, if I walk into the house, they're helping me carry things in. It's very much the machismo.
Class is a big part of it.
It's a class, and I live in San Juan Coastal. It's a poor section.
Yeah.
I think there's a huge class basis.
And that's where you would see that men might feel more threatened by an open sense of masculinity because, the only identity they've known or the only security they have is in their physical sort of power or whatever. So if women are starting to advance, and I think, at some level, there's a sense of feeling that where being left behind or passed up or just having some privileges that you used to have not taken for granted anymore. I was looking at some advertising this morning when if you search on Machismo, you'll find a lot of ads from the US from the 50s. I had one where, the husband has the wife over his lap and it says, this is what your husband will do if you don't taste test your coffee brew, or something. It was just bizarre. I mean, they're dressed, he's got a suit on and she's got the full dress, but he's about to whack her. And, so expressions of violence and sort of control they're only a few decades removed from being popular or accepted, but it's definitely a new day, but as we'll see after the break, there is still a serious problem that is somewhat unique to the Mexican situation because of some other dynamics too, class and I think the drug situation. And what else? Economics, sure. I want to be conscious of our time, so this is a good time for our first break. So let's do that and we'll just take a quick break. Thanks.
And I have the list of ingredients that are on the vegetarian's plate for Saturday. So if you want to come up, I'll tell you. Thank you.
Okay. So we'll pick things up again, and we'll go back to the, who had the question on the zoot suits? Was that you in the middle there? Was that your question on the zoot suit? Yes. So it turns out it began in the African American community in the 30s and 40s because it was easier to dance in that, you know, free-flowing long suits and all that. So it was actually worn mainly by African American men originally, including a young Malcolm X. Can you picture Malcolm X in a zoot suit? Now, during the rationing of World War II, it was criticized as being a wasteful, you know, use of cloth, and wool was being rationed. So the War Production Board issued restrictions aimed at stopping the sale of zoot suits in 1942. But then the zoot suit riots of 1943, I think, is probably what caught your memory. Groups, because it was picked up by the Mexican American community as a symbol of identity. But in the riots, the Mexican community became victims of, zoot suiters became victims of repeated mob violence. And although the zoot suit was never banned, although it was debated by the Los Angeles City Council whether they were going to ban the zoot suit in the aftermath of the riots. But it became an important symbol of cultural pride and defiance in the Chicano movement. And it had a brief resurgence in the swing revival of the 1990s. And the suit is still worn by Chicanos in Mexican subcultures as a way to memorialize events and celebrations and special occasions. So yeah, it's got a lot of little history packed in. And you know, I never paid much attention to fashion, I have to admit. And was criticized for it sometimes, saying, you need to work on your wardrobe, you know, a bit, which is probably always going to be true. But, you know, I never realized till I started studying a little bit more, went to some exhibits, how much history is embedded in fashion as well, right? As well as, of course, architecture and so, you know, we're living history as well. But at the Blue House, Frida's house in Mexico City, in Coyoacan, they had a wonderful exhibit of different dresses that she had worn and different periods. And I think it was a touring, and it might even be something you can find on the internet to look at. Is there a book that came out on it? Yeah, it was a wonderful display. And so again, yeah, good catch there. And so speaking of class and poverty and violence, I thought I'd share, I have several videos, but I think we'll just do one to start with, because they are on a little bit longer side, and they're a little graphic, I have to say, but I think it's important to look at this phenomena of femicide that has had two major loci, I guess you would say, or locations. One around the border in Ciudad Juarez, around where you all know about the maquiladoras, the big factories that, I mean, the U.S., in a way, what you find in northern Mexico and in some parts is, are things that the U.S. wants, but doesn't want in the U.S. So a lot of factories there with much lower paid work than you would have to pay in the U.S. And it's largely, the workers are largely women. And so this is the setting, you know, of the risks that they run just living there. And that's one locus. And then outside of Mexico City, you have the state of Mexico, you know, which is much larger and more rural. And that is a real area of poverty and struggle and sort of a social breakdown, because many people migrate to the big city, to Mexico City, looking for work, but they have to live on the very outskirts because of the cost of living and not having work. So these communities that spring up don't have any deep roots, you know, and when you don't have deep-rooted communities, all sorts of sort of social norms break down. And anyway, so why don't we take a look at this report on femicide, and then we can have a little bit of an informed conversation. So Fernanda, if you'd like to bring up that video we selected.
Police say so far this month, 11 women have been killed in Juarez.
The unit that investigates crimes against women across our border is releasing some new numbers.
The 2 women who were killed and found dismembered.
Body of a young woman, woman's body was found.
In 1995, law enforcement in the city of Juarez made a gruesome discovery. A mass grave that contained the bodies of women who'd been systematically brutalized. Many had their hands tied behind their backs and displayed signs that they had been sexually assaulted. Investigators also noticed a disturbing clue as to who may have been responsible for the killings. Several of the bodies had a triangle carved into their backs. These didn't just look like murders. These looked like ritual killings. These women had been tortured.
Every week since his daughter disappeared more than a year ago, Gaspar Mendoza has waited outside the state prosecutor's office in Ciudad Juarez, looking for help.
A year later, another one of these mass graves was discovered that contained the bodies of women and even teenage girls who had been horrifically tortured and murdered. In the coming months and years, a total of 5 mass graves were discovered in and around the city of Juarez. But as law enforcement agencies on both sides of the borders searched for answers, more women and teenage girls were going missing. Some of their bodies had been drowned in seedy hotel bathrooms, disregarded in the deserts, or mutilated on the outskirts of poor neighborhoods. Since the discovery of the first mass graves in 1995, the bodies of hundreds of women, some bearing strange symbols carved into them, have been discovered. Hundreds of other women and teenage girls have vanished from the streets while walking to school or work, never to be heard from again. My name is Vincent Vargas. I am the host of the Borderland podcast, an Ironclad original, and I am a Border Patrol Search, Trauma, and Rescue Unit veteran with years of experience working on the U.S.-Mexico border. On the southern border, there is a legal concept known as reasonable fear. If an asylum officer determines that a migrant has a reasonable fear of persecution or torture if returned to their home country, then removal procedures can be delayed. And in the current border crisis, there has been no greater source of reasonable fear cases than the Mexican drug cartels. In each episode of this special Borderland docuseries, Reasonable Fear, I take a deep dive into the border crisis to find the primary players behind the violence, the scope of these transnational criminal enterprises, and the state of the narco wars.
This was a group of powerful people.
Never been seen before in Mexico.
Evidence of ritualistic elements.
We ended up rescuing almost 200 kids.
The discovery of multiple women in mass graves.
They're almost in every state.
When you put it together, you have an economic extortion map.
But even more violent.
I didn't want to show right now. They're both very good. This one you can find and follow, and it has to do with the border in particular. But I think the other. You need your mic. Oh, well, we're just going to watch different videos. What year? I'm sorry. Well, the one that we just is actually current. Although it's going back to the 90s, the femicide at the border dates back to the 90s. But I want to show a little more contemporary view right now. And then if we may have time to come back to this one, but it's a 4-part series. I was just going to show you part 1, but it's available from the It's called Borderland Reasonable Fear, yeah.
Bibliography?
Yes, I'll have a link to it. For the videos, I'll provide links. For the books, you know, the title. So why don't we get the other one going?
I'm Ahmed Shahabuddin, and you're in The Stream. The unsolved death of a young woman in northern Mexico has shocked people across the country and highlighted an emergency of gender-based violence. In 2020, we here at The Stream looked at the persistent crisis of femicide in Mexico, but 2 years later, murders of women and girls based on their gender are still rising. Today, we ask why. Here's a little bit more context from AJ Plus about the case of Devani Escobar. For more on all of this, we're joined from Mexico City by Edith Olivares Ferreto. She is Executive Director at Amnesty International Mexico. Also in Mexico City, Estefania Vela-Barba. She is Executive Director at Intersecta, a feminist organization. And from Monterrey, we have Chantal Flores, a journalist and author of an upcoming book about enforced disappearances of women in Mexico. Of course, we want you to join today's conversation. As always, send your comments and questions through our YouTube chat, just right here, and we'll bring them directly to our guests. Ladies, thank you for being with us. I want to start, Chantal, directly with you, because I understand you've reported on this for more than, the better part of a decade on femicide, and you're in Monterrey, where, she was found, unfortunately. I want to ask you, what do we have to understand about this incident in the context of everything else that's happened? Why is this problem getting worse?
Well, I will say the main thing is that authorities are not investigating, right? They keep seeing the disappearances of women and femicides as isolated events and also as individual acts of bad behavior, right? They refuse to acknowledge, and when I say they, I'm talking about all the way from the municipal level to the federal level, right? So it's the government in every step, and they keep refusing to acknowledge the systemic inequalities that women face across the country, but also the general context of disappearances that exist in the country, right? So I think the problem starts from there. As we saw with Devani's case, she was the one to blame for her own disappearance, right? And we keep seeing this narrative that we are the ones to blame for our own deaths and disappearances.
So the government blaming the victims, obviously an old narrative that was used once again. I do want to ask you, Estefania, why do you think, or is it true that this particular case in Monterrey sort of reactivated a lot of people to actually speak out and get into the streets? Is there something specific about her case?
I think this particular case has to do, again, with a very old story. It's going to be almost 30 years, for example, since feminists, particularly and families, started denouncing the increase of the murders of women in the city of Juarez in Chihuahua. So at least for 30 years, we've been having in one way or another this type of conversation. I think in this case, I don't know about my co-panelists, but seeing her in the street alone, and I think it connects many of us to that feeling of vulnerability and insecurity, and how in spite of 30 years of this ongoing conversation, statistics show that we are nowhere near solving the problems, but actually that the problem continues. In many cases, it has become even more complex.
And, we're seeing some images there of people reacting. It's a very visceral and emotional moment, but a moment that you said really spans 3 decades. Let's listen to what some protesters had to say after they discovered Devani's body there in Monterrey. Take a listen. All right, it seems we're trying to get there.
On this occasion concerning Dubani and all of the women that have been found in Nuevo Leon State, I want to say that we are not fools. We do not need to be lawyers or have a degree to realize that there is no justice, not even posthumously.
To be honest, it happens very often, regardless of Dubani. We have had several femicides in 1 month. That is what we fight for. That is why we come here every time these things happen. And also on dates like March 8th, International Women's Day. We come here to be heard and to make these things stop.
Edith, I see you're nodding. When you hear what some of those protesters had to say, what comes to mind about where we are in this moment and how to move forward?
Thank you. I think the biggest problem in Mexico is impunity, and that's why people, and especially women, take the streets to protest. And this is the other way, the other point in this conversation that we have to have, because we are in this kind of spring, feminist spring in Mexico, but it's a movement who are increasing because the violence against women are increasing and the impunity is unresolved during these 30 years, as Estefania said.
And Estefania, you're hearing, her kind of outline how long it's going, echoing some of what you said. And we know the state is failing to actually address this. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a protest movement. We wouldn't be seeing or even maybe having this conversation. With that in mind, Estefania, where does the role of data come in? I mean, is the government even aware of just the scale of the problem?
I think two things are important to say. Data is key, because if you don't have data, it's very hard to understand the problem. And if you don't understand the problem, it's very hard to come up with an adequate solution. In this regard, I think it's important to highlight two things. In the first place, we don't even know really how many femicides there are. We do not have an adequate estimate of how many of the killings of women are related to gender-based violence, even according to one of the many legal definitions we have. I think this speaks to the government's lack of interest in better understanding the problem. So that's one. How many cases like Dubani there are, we can't even say for certain. We know how many women are killed, but not how many cases, the nitty-gritty of the situation. On the other hand, and I'm sure we can talk about this more, how many women, also, let's remember that this case began, it was announced that she had disappeared. A few days went by without her body being found, and the magnitude of the problem of disappearances in Mexico is also unknown. We have databases that instead of getting better, in many ways have gotten worse. So I think that is one key element of the lack of interest in the problem.
Yeah, and you talk about the lack of interest. We also know that many people criticize the government not just for being deflective, but really being negligent. And we have one comment from Janice Gallagher that kind of outlines what's actually going on with the government and how they're choosing to not address this. Take a listen.
So to understand why the case of Devani Escobar has received so much attention, we need to remember that this is in the context of years of protests in response to both femicides and disappearances in Mexico, and endless promises by the government that things are going to change. Instead, what do we see? First, we see a government who their first instinct in this investigation was to blame the victim. Second, we see egregious investigatory and forensic errors. And third, we see a government who still isn't taking responsibility both for the investigation of what happened to Devani Escobar, as well as taking all steps possible to make sure this never happens to anyone else again.
I'm curious, Chantal, why is there so much impunity for gender-based violence in Mexico? I mean, why, and what is being done about it? Or are you optimistic that the government will address it?
No, I'm not optimistic at all. And I think that was the general feeling or the collective feeling on April 22 during the protest here in Monterrey. I've been covering the feminist protests for a while. And this one, we gotta remember that Monterrey, Nuevo León, is very conservative. We don't see the protests, the feminist protests that we usually see in Mexico City. So on April 22nd, when hundreds of women took to the streets to protest this, the general feeling was not only anger as we usually see, for instance, on March 8th. But it was devastating. It was sad. There was hopelessness that we don't know what to do anymore. You know, I come here as a journalist, but I'm also a woman living in Monterrey. And it's just so frustrating that we don't see an exit to this. And the other thing is that the government refuses to acknowledge that the disappearances of women and girls are perpetrated by both state actors, criminal organizations, and this is sending a permission to men in general across society that they can also disappear our bodies and nothing will happen to them. And I think that's the scariest thing, right? That there's this permission to do anything to women, and there are not going to be consequences.
And perhaps that's where the complicity comes in on the government's sort of inaction. Estefania, I saw that you were nodding as we heard from Chantal there. I'm curious, how well resourced are police, are prosecutors, you know, in order to actually tackle these cases, not just the murders and femicide, but also disappearances?
I think there's two things I want to highlight. No, it's on the one hand, how authorities react to individual cases. And I think that, as it has been said, this case is exemplary of what we see across the board. We have underfunded institutions. And this is the best case, because many times we highlight, for example, public servants that are machistas. What is tragic about our country is that even when you have public servants that are truly committed to the cause, resources aren't always what is necessary to properly investigate the cases. So this is one thing, and I'm sure Edith can delve into it more. The other thing I want to highlight, though, and we can talk about this further, is beyond the individual cases and how they are processed by prosecutors, by courts, what is the overall strategy of security? And one thing that I think is important to highlight, both for the killings of women and for the disappearances of women, is that both have increased in the context of the so-called war on drugs, which in the case of Mexico included the increase of the strategy of militarizing public security. So it's not just that the prosecuting or justice institutions are failing, but the tools that we use to supposedly fight organized crime in this case not only have not solved the problem.
Yeah, sorry, I don't want to cut you off. You're saying it hasn't solved the problem. I'm going to let Edith finish your sentence because she was nodding. I know you want to get in there. Edith, what about what Estefania was saying is kind of on the mark here?
Yes, I think it's important to remember that it is a problem of indolence of the state. This is an indolent state about violence against women. And we have already, I don't know, 30 years, more or less, with these deficiencies in the investigation of women killers since Ciudad Juárez. And right now, we can say all Mexico is turning into Ciudad Juárez because the number of killers, the number of disappearances of women and girls, the deficiencies in the investigation of the murders and the disappearances of women are the same as 30 years ago. So it's worse, I think, because since the sentence of Campo Algodonero, we have all this framework or institutions and legal advances, but they don't be applied by the authorities. So it's worse.
And also,
go ahead, Chantal.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think also we need to be careful that we keep talking about women as an homogeneous group, right? And we gotta remember that the women who were being killed in Ciudad Juárez, they were workers, right? And we don't have the information to really understand the dynamics of violence in each state in Mexico and to understand what is a more vulnerable group of women who are at risk of being disappeared and killed. We don't have that information because we keep saying don't kill us, but we are not the same even as women. We are not considering the intersecting factors. And that's important in the conversation.
I appreciate you bringing that up, obviously, as well, you know, socio-political factors, geographic factors, and that's why the data is so important as you've been making the case. For our audience who may not know, I don't know what the exact statistic is, but we've been pointing to the fact that a lot of crimes in general in Mexico they go unsolved, even unaddressed. I've seen numbers upwards of 90, maybe 98% of crimes. With that in mind, I want to share what this translates to in the streets, in the homes, for people who are directly affected by this. There's a level of anger that is very palpable that I want to try to convey to our audience through this clip, which includes the mother of a missing woman. Take a listen.
Authorities don't do what they have to do in a timely fashion. For them, when someone goes missing, they are just absent or lost. They continue arguing that we need to wait 72 hours to start searching. Instead of going forward in the attorney's office for missing people, we seem to be going backwards.
I have had friends who have gone missing, who have been raped, and nothing has been done about it. Specific cases have drawn attention from the authorities, but this is a reality that has exceeded because this is something that has been going on for many years.
Stefania, you've heard these women. I see that you're nodding with a lot of the points that they're making. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the president, but this New York Times article sums it up quite well. Mexico's president says most domestic violence calls are fake. He's also deflected and downplayed this by saying, you know, this really happens everywhere. It's not specific to, you know, the problem isn't specifically problematic here in Mexico. Estefania, that anger and the presidents and the governments on all stages lack to address this. I mean, do you see any hope that in 30 years we won't be having the same conversation? Another 30 years?
That's why we're here, I think. I think the three of us have that hope that by creating enough awareness, by betting all our efforts in not just everybody that's currently an adult, but on the kids and the children and everybody, there's a possible change. I think the difference between right now and 30 years ago is that we at least have some lessons as to what hasn't worked, which I think it's an important lesson. Like I mentioned, one of the things that time goes by and more evidence is accumulated is if you want to fight these levels of violence, which are extraordinary and continue under this government, militarization is not the adequate strategy. If you want to work with prosecutors and police, they need to be well funded, they need to be properly trained, they need to have adequate institutional frameworks.
Yeah.
This is also important because, just to mention in this case, for example, Nuevo León has a special prosecutor for femicide. So in 30 years, we have created specialized institutions for gender equality. And what we're seeing is that if you still don't have a deeper institutional reform, these institutions are going to be outliers.
And obviously, yeah, please, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. Finish your point.
No.
I was just going to
say, my only hope is,
let's
learn from 30 years.
Right. That can be applied in so many conversations here at the stream. You know, so many lessons perhaps go unlearned for too long, and that's why we're talking about them still. But Chantal, with that in mind, you know, we've heard about the need to address this on the governmental level. Institutionally. What about the culture? Of course, it's all very linked. You know, a lot of people online and in our comments saying patriarchy plays a big role in all of this, preventing the investigations. What can you share with us about that? Is that accurate?
Yes, definitely. I mean, Monterrey is in the north, super machista society, conservative. The main objective in this society is economic progress, right? So usually human rights violations or any social issues are being covered by the government, right? And the media too, because we also eventually need to play about the role of the media, mainstream media in this. But, you know, I really wanted to highlight that a cultural change that we have seen, we have a strong feminist movement or movements, but we also have a very strong movement of families and mothers of the disappeared who are leading the search. And I think we usually separate, you know, femicides with this movement of families.
Chantal, you've worked personally with a lot of those families, I know, because my producer told me, and so I'm glad you brought it up because I was curious. There's one anecdote about how families are coming to you to sort of, I don't know how to put it really, but this desire to sort of go viral. I mean, it's not just the case that we heard about recently. Could you share with our audience just that sort of phenomenon? It's quite tragic.
Yes, that has been, I think, heartbreaking in the past weeks because they see all the attention that Nuevo León, and not only the Bunny's case, but other disappearances in the state has gained. And they text me, you know, like, how can I make it to the New York Times? How can I, you know, bring all this attention to the case of my missing daughter? And many of those cases, they know that their daughter has been missing even for over 10 years.
Right.
So I think it's really frustrating that we have created a system when social media and the public decide which lives deserve the attention.
Right. And
I think that's heartbreaking.
And Edith, I want to come to you, but before I do, I want to share with you three and our audience a video comment that came in from Jennifer Piscopo, kind of outlining why she thinks the impunity needs to end and how we may go about doing that. Take a listen.
Mexico's state and federal governments must end impunity for abusers. Perpetrators are rarely held accountable for hurting and killing women, which sends the message that the abuse is not important and can continue. The problem is that prosecutors, governors, and even the president himself spout misogynistic myths that hold women responsible for the crimes against them, suggesting, for instance, that women are loose or immoral and therefore deserve the violence. This is not true. Accountability must start at the top, and it's voters who must hold politicians accountable. They must vote out the governors, the parties, and the president who spout such misogynistic ideas. They must send the message that the next political leaders are responsible for investigating crimes properly and for bringing perpetrators to justice.
So Edith, I'm curious if you agree. Yes. She says accountability must start at the top. She echoes a lot of what's already been discussed on this show. Moving forward, where does accountability start and how can we reform the system?
Yes, I'm interesting to highlight the point that this kind of disorder in our state is institutional violence. And this state, the state of Mexico, the state of Mexico, not only in the Estado de Mexico, but the Mexican state is guilty of institutional violence against the victims of the women disappearances and victims of feminicide, because this is a state who made a lot of violence with the victims, with the families of the victims.
Right.
They delayed the process, they attack the families, and the families don't have, maybe never, truth, justice, and damage reparation.
And I'm curious, to bring justice, Chantal, where would you put your flashlight, the first thing that needs to really be focused on for those who want to see justice in these cases?
I think right now something that the families of the missing are missing is the support from the rest of society, as they have seen in the past days that a family got that support in some way, right? So I think the main thing is to continue with this, is more of society, because the society, is divided, but the real divide is the pain they are carrying and the pain we are not willing to see in our fellow citizens, right? So I think that's the first thing, because this problem is collective, and we gotta start, joining the families in this fight. And then from there, I think we can do a lot to keep the government accountable. We gotta stop focusing on this reform and this, because there's no political will, resources, or anything.
Right. And we have a lot of comments in our YouTube section. I want to read one out before we go. This is from Lee saying, maybe classes to educate Mexican boys while still in school that girls and women are not objects or disposable. So obviously pointing to the cultural education that needs to happen. Ladies, thank you for sharing your voices with us. That's all the time we have for today, but this is a conversation we're going to continue to cover here at the stream. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Pretty good coverage there, yeah? Okay, we got a question in the back here. Let's take this one in the back first, if we can. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any programs that would teach young girls and women self-defense, jiu-jitsu, karate, at a young age? If they start learning it, they can get pretty proficient at it. And also to make them more aware of their surroundings, you know, when they go out, you know, things to look for, you know,
Sure.
go in groups, that sort of thing.
Sure.
Anything like that available?
Well, I think there is a wider acceptance. I've noticed a lot of martial arts schools in the cities I've been in, and with a lot of girls in class. So that's a great point. Yeah, and yeah.
I'm not against blaming the government and impunity. I'm not against that, but everything is impunity. Impunity is if the only reason men are not killing women is because the government is going to put them in jail. And I don't think that's the cause. Impunity is not the cause of this systematic problem. People don't go out and kill women just because they're going to be punished or not punished. I don't see that.
Well, I think it's a number of factors, but I think impunity is pretty important. I did a course on the reform of the judicial system here, because for years it was a different kind of law system where the accused would kind of be dragged into jail and then have to, you were presumed guilty until you proved yourself innocent. But what it uncovered is that, as they alluded to, it is over 90% of crimes go unpunished, which means really there is no criminal justice, which means you wouldn't even pause. I think where impunity comes in, or where it can be a prohibiting factor or a restraining factor for men, is if they see the fella next door who, beat his wife, gets dragged away and thrown into jail, he may think twice before he takes that same step. So I think men do feel, above the law when it comes to domestic violence, unfortunately. So I think it is a factor in that sense. But let's see what your question is.
Well, I remember in the 80s, I think, that the maquiladoras, it basically was thought that they just hired women and that they do hire women. Like 80% of maquiladoras are women and I remember it was because they had good dexterity, better than the male, and that they were easier to manage. And so it's a way that capitalism can be at the root, part of the roots of you're disempowering men, and
that's it, yeah.
Yeah,
so there are layers there where the women could find work and the men could not, and that doesn't lead in if it's that unbalanced. And you're right that they do favor women because they feel like they're more easily controlled, more responsible, and other factors. Yeah.
And the impunity piece, what we can see in the larger picture, if we go north, that how much, there's not an accountability, and that the best part of machismo inside of a male or a female, the best part of dignity and integrity,
the healthy part,
if people stood up to the bullies,
right,
we could really change things.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Next door, yeah.
Yeah, that was really disturbing to watch. And at the beginning, I was going like, I can't even connect it to machismo. I mean, I think of machismo as really out there and maybe abusive sometimes, but this is some kind of sickness going on. And I agree with accountability is absolutely necessary,
right?
But it's not the root cause.
It doesn't completely explain it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. We've got an eager person in the back to join in, so go ahead and make your comment.
The African American community has been extraordinary in showing us the way to hold abusers accountable, and self-defense is not helpful to teach a young teenager as if that self-defense is going to do anything but give a false sense of security. No, the way to hold abusers accountable is through the cell phone. Every teenager should have a cell phone that can take video, and when they witness someone alone on the streets, they videotape it. It's not for the victim to videotape. It's for that heroic African-American, I think she was a teenager, who videotaped the assault and death of the African-American, what's his name? You got it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I do have a couple of slides before the break, but let's take this one more comment first. Go ahead.
They say that rape is not an act of sex, but it's an act of violence and control. So in that, I see that maybe these men are not only raping these young women, but they are out of control. They feel a loss of their own power, so that's all they can do is to beat up on a woman.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, these are not sexual crimes of, pleasure by any stretch, yeah.
I noticed that the example of the government's response was spoken by AMLO, the previous president of Mexico. Do we know how Claudia Sheinbaum is reacting to this?
Yeah.
Or is she reacting?
Yeah.
She is.
No, I think it is good to see, and I think the women on this video might have taken some hope from that change of government. And Carlos will have a lot to say, so be sure to ask him on that. So let's get, that was 22 and 23. So that was in the heart of the AMLO years. And I remember when he said that about most of the calls were fake. I mean, that was... What's that? He said there were no fentanyl factories in Mexico, too. No fentanyl factories. Oh, okay. Yeah. So let's see the remaining slides on femicide. It just got 2 or 3, and then we'll take a break. Okay, so I can't see the big screen, so I'll see mine. But the mural, Sowing Memory, Reaping Justice, represents the community and the victims of femicide in the state of Mexico. So I thought, we should see some images of hope. It's not all, there are responses. The women alluded to in the interviews there, families, women, mothers. So let's see the next slide. You can keep it on the slides for now, if you would. So Norma Andrade in front of the artwork for Clara in woman's hands in Geneva, Switzerland. She was, Norma is someone to look up and look up to. She's been instrumental as a mother of a daughter who was murdered. She's spearheaded other mothers demanding justice, and they found ways to represent it artistically with kind of a handprint mural. And then our next one is also in the state of Mexico, and Voices in Resistance, Murals for Justice and Memory, seeks to dignify all mothers who fight for their daughters killed by femicidal violence. So that's right, and these are very poor neighborhoods, so it's good to see that. And I've got one more for you. And this just happened last year, or actually this year. It was in May. And it really shocked me. I mean, somehow I came across this. Valeria Marquez was shot and killed while live streaming. She was on TikTok. A trans woman who I believe she's trans. No, I should have looked up her story right before. I have the maybe we could ask Fernanda can you click on the New York Times link that's there and bring it up? I don't have internet to see what the headline says. Can you do that with your... Are you able to just click on the link? If not, that's fine. It would be in the PowerPoint. You'd have to go back to the original PowerPoint slide. Well, let me just say the point is that the killer came in knowing that she had gained a following on you know, the social media, which is something that a lot of, you know, young people are doing very successfully. But the impunity with somebody coming in and shooting her in the middle of her live stream, I think, was what really shocked me. So I'll put a link. It's okay, Fernanda. I'll put a link in the resources, and you can look up her story. But I wanted you to know that, you know, it's very much present with us. And I think it is a combination of factors, you know, that have to do with neglect, but also culture, you know, going real deep. And, you know, there's the reverse side is really the respect for women that needs to start very early. The connection I see is with the other video we had of the young college students. Now you've got it up there? So this is her story, I guess. No, that's not the link. It's okay. I wanted the New York Times in English, but it's a TikToker influencer that's murdered in Mexico, was, you know, live. But the feminist, you can let it go for now. The woman who spoke about the way we encase boys in a very rigid sense of masculinity. You know, if they're raised that way with a very limited range of options and cut off from emotions, you can see the results when, especially when combined with the drug issue and the drinking. And I will say that young men, or adolescents really, in Mexico, most every one of them in any kind of poorer area is going to be faced with a very difficult choice at a very young age, you know, of 13, 14, 15, because they are going to be recruited into gang life. And they're going to have to make a choice, you know, to either join up and do the tasks that are required of them by the gang leaders, or they're going to be subject to violence themselves. And I think many of them do choose that life as a, you know, just for self-preservation. And of course that will lead to also, I think, it factors very much into this deeply embedded problem. Now, as a historian, you know, I don't have enough perspective of years to give you the historical analysis other than some of the things that we've traced thus far in terms of gender roles and expectations. But I think it does go back also very much to the patriarchal sort of mindset as well, that the man, you know, has to be in control at some level. So why don't we take a break, and we'll quick break, and then we'll finish up after that break with a little bit more of a hopeful theme. I want to leave you with some hope. Okay, Fernanda, if you could bring up the slide with the map on it, I think. The Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So seeing that map, what do you think we're going to talk about now? Muxes, the Muxe community, okay? I've made some references to this third gender phenomena in indigenous culture that express itself in different ways, but the Muxe represent one of the oldest continuous third gender traditions in the world. They're primarily found in the Zapotec communities of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. So that's the most narrow point of the Mexican peninsula there. And it's centered in Juchitán de Zaragoza, Oaxaca, which is kind of a remote region. but the Muxe have presence throughout the Isthmus region, and they're part of the broader Zapotec cultural community in southern Mexico. So we're going to look first at the ancient Zapotec society, where there was evidence of third gender roles dating back 1,000 years in Zapotec codices and archaeological remains. The Zapotec civilization from about 500 before the Camhi era, or before BC, we say, or BCE, to about 1500 Common Era. So that's 2,000 years. That's the Zapotec period of dominance. It had a very sophisticated understanding of gender fluidity. For instance, Monteaban, the archaeological site, and other Zapotec sites show artistic depictions of non-binary figures. There's an integration into pre-Hispanic social structure as valued community members, not as outcasts. Connection to broader Mesoamerica traditions, because there were similar roles and are among the Mayan, Aztec, and other indigenous groups, just not quite as prominently surviving. I think because of the remoteness of this region, they've been able to survive, whereas areas that came under the influence of Spanish Catholicism ran into big problems. So the concept is that some people naturally embody both masculine and feminine energies. Actually, we all do if we really understand ourselves, holistically, right? But in a very special way, the Muxe, very much embody this energy, and it was considered sacred. So when the Spanish arrived, they brought a European binary gender concepts and a Christian condemnation of this third gender. Catholic missionaries specifically targeted indigenous gender diversity as sinful and demonic. And Inquisition records do show persecution of individuals with non-conforming gender expressions. But despite about 300 years of colonial pressure, the Muxe identity survived in the remote communities. And they partly survived through syncretism, that mixture of taking on a Catholic saint devotions while maintaining their identity. So it became a way to kind of connect with the church on one level of ritual and devotion. And so in some sense be tolerated at least, if not totally accepted by the church. The geographic isolation of Juchitán has helped preserve it, particularly there where it is, as a cultural phenomena. And the language preservation is crucial. The Zapotec language has maintained, because it has certain terms and concepts specific to this. Muxe itself is probably from a Zapotec word, muxe, which means woman or feminine person. M-U-X-E, muxe. Oh. Yes. It is related somewhat to the Spanish word mujer, right, which is woman, but it's rooted in the pre-Columbian, so it goes before the Spanish arrival. And it's not men dressed as women, it's not men who dress as women, but people with a distinct third gender identity, which Zapotec worldview recognized, man, women, and Muxe as three identities. They are people who would have been assigned male at birth, as they say, or would have been, physically, genetically, but naturally express a feminine characteristic. But it's a community recognition. It's based on behavior, not strictly the anatomy or the sexual orientation. So some Muxe marry women, some live celibately, and some marry men or are with men. So it's not, a sexual identity. We have a question related to that particular point.
You talk about the third gender, and it seems as though men dress as women, but I haven't heard of women dressing as men and being in that same environment. Is that the case, or?
Well, in the Muxe phenomena, the Muxe are men, biological men dressed as women. So there isn't a parallel tradition that I'm aware of biological girls growing up and dressing as men who then created this community, okay? There are certainly, in fact, we found evidence during the Mexican Revolution, as I said, of women who dressed as men and then lived as men. So it is a good question, though, that it kind of goes one way, in one direction, doesn't it? Now, their traditional family role, they have a family role that they usually remain in the parental household for life. They have a special relationship with their mothers and grandmothers. They have caregiving responsibilities for elderly family members. So in a way, if a family has a Muxe child, they feel blessed in a way because they know they're going to have somebody who's going to take on that role of caring for the aging parents. And they have various skills for trade. They're involved in textile production, embroidery. You'll see a lot of embroidery in some of the images and video. They have little market vendors, flower arranging and decorative arts, beauty and fashion. They participate also in the religious festivals, in the community celebrations. And so they're kind of a bridge sometimes between the traditional and the modern practices. And they have a particular practice called las velas. The vela is a candle, but it's also a word used for a wake, for instance, after a death. It's the vela. But it's also various kinds of celebrations. It's a sacred festival. The Vela tradition, it's particular to the Muxe community. It's an annual patron saint festival in the Zapotec culture that the Muxe play a crucial role in organizing and participating in. It's kind of a blend of Catholic and indigenous spiritual elements. And there's a particular Vela, I learned that the Muxe started themselves in the 1970s with this interesting name of Vela de las auténticas intrépidas buscadoras de peligro. So the celebration of the authentic, brave risk takers. Buscadores de peligro, you would say, are risk-taking people, you know. So that's a specific Muxe organized celebration I have some images of for you. It's a recognition and celebration of Muxe identity, and the community gathers to strengthen the cultural bond, so it's a chance to kind of build social cohesion. And I will say they're not universally accepted, and you'll hear in some of their testimony that, you know, they face also abuse, you know, there are some people who are hostile towards them. Anyway, so they face some contemporary challenges. I just want to end this overview by saying that, you know, globalization and cultural pressure, the migration to urban centers, you know, affects any kind of traditional community, obviously. Western concepts of gender and sexuality are also kind of create a new dynamic because they don't want to be confused with trans people. You know, they don't feel like that's their identity. They're Muxe, you know, and it's not something that can be kind of universalized. It's specific. Also, there's an intersection, of course, with both the LGBT communities and movements, and also indigenous rights movements, because these are indigenous people. And so younger Muxe particularly are kind of navigating more this challenge between the traditional and the modern that we're all involved in, especially in those communities. So it's a balance of cultural preservation with personal autonomy too. And so there's been growing documentation and academic interest in anthropological studies. So they've become more prominent on the global stage because they demonstrate diversity of human gender expressions across cultures, which is important. And they kind of challenge the, you know, the binary notions of gender. and also offer a sense of indigenous cultural resistance. So that's kind of their ongoing legacy also to, they're kind of a living legacy to pre-Columbian cultural continuity because they go back before the Spanish, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the sacaros in the parades, the men that dress up as women. Is that part of this culture? I've always been curious about how this became part of our local festivals, is to have the, what do they call sacaros, what are they called? Sakayas. The sakayas, the men in parades that dress up as women here.
Yeah, that term, is that a term here used locally? Because it's not a term I'm familiar with in the parades. If you want to give a little more context to that, somebody who's witnessed it. Looks like Matt's going. Does Matt have a comment on that? Yeah.
No, I don't have a comment on that, but another question from Zoom, so I'll let you
I don't think
finish.
I can help you in any way of giving insight, because I'm not even aware of people with that role of leading parades, but they're men dressed as women. But what kind of parades? Any specific kinds, or like the military, Independence Day, they'll have a woman leading, a man dressed as a woman? I didn't know that. I haven't been exposed to that, so sorry. But if you want to send me an email with the term, I can look it up for you. You've got my email, everyone, right? Dan Grippo, DANGRIPPO, @yahoo.com, if you want to ask me anything. Go ahead, Matt. What have you got back there?
So the question is, what were the specific roles of the Muxe in the Zapotec community when you said they were respected?
Respected?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, they were family, domestic. A Muxe would normally stay with the family, caregiving in the family setting, in the parental household. And then there's specific talents with both embroidery and flowers and decorative arts would be a role for them in the society. Yeah. And so why don't we bring up some slides, Fernanda? Oops. Yeah. Actually, for the first time, Vogue Mexico put a Muxe on the cover a couple of years ago. And of course, that's a Muxe person dressed up. And then the next slide. You've got, this would be the vela. And we have, interestingly, Muxe will dress in the full traditional, dress, but also at times they'll go shirtless, to kind of create as that lower right, creates kind of a different, kind of a gender bending, it's like, oh, I guess they have male bodies underneath all those dresses, or what we call biologically male. So they're also kind of defying, this is part of that vela that they hold, kind of expressing themselves that way. And so now I have, the next slide would be The Guardian did a nice little piece on, that'll give us the context and the life, about 6 minutes, I believe. So why don't we go ahead and watch that. That's a great video, isn't it? Yeah, well, it's not all a bed of roses. We've got a question in the middle.
In all the reading that I've done over the years, I've developed the impression that the Muxe or the non-binary people who are born into native populations that don't have the Christian bent are frequently admired and basically considered blessed by the gods. And it's when you run across the Christian influence that they start getting judgmental and condemning. And I think this last video is fascinating. I didn't know there was such a thing.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and I think it does track with what you're saying, yeah. There wasn't a sense of the concept of sin, you know, I mentioned the first day when the Spanish arrived, they really struggled to try to convey why certain sexual activity was not to be undertaken, and they said, well, it's sinful, you know, and the people, they didn't have that concept. It's not an indigenous concept. Yeah, I think what we're seeing is a dynamic playing out. I'm actually eager to actually visit there someday. I'd really like to see that community while it still exists. I hope it survives another century.
It's an absolutely wonderful experience, and there's a time in May, I think, where many of the churches schedule their villas at the same time, so you can go to multiple villas, all a little different. And they usually take place on the square of a church, and these are smaller churches, not big, huge. But one thing that I think differently than something I heard here is that the priests are not allowed. So you got a church with a priest, you got a square outside of it. For that day or days of the vela, the priest is not allowed to be in the church or in the square.
I believe that.
Yeah, so it's really, you know, they do make a separation.
Yeah. Well, I encountered that in Chiapas when I went to San Cristobal de las Casas, you know, which is a good town to visit as well. But there's a church there that the indigenous people run the church, and the priest, has to ask permission to come in. I mean, it is their place,
Well, the rest of the year, the priest goes back to the role that he had before.
Yeah. Well, that's why I want to leave you with a recommendation for a series, because HBO, I may have said Netflix, but I believe, as you'll see, it's HBO has done The Secret of the River. It's actually, what it is, it's not a documentary, it's a fiction, it's a story, a series. Unfortunately, just a limited series. I could watch many seasons, but it's like 6 or 7 episodes of the story of a mystery and a murder and a life of a Muxe. And it's about a Muxe who's growing up with a best friend who then can't accept that his friend is Muxe. It's a little bit like that young boy that was on the screen there. The way, some people are more accepting than others. And there's a good episode where they go to the priest and say, we want to do this ceremony, and he's like, oh, I don't think you should do it here at our church. And there's a back and forth, between resistance and acceptance in the church. So it's something that you can access and get an up-close view. And but before I show that, I just want to make sure, are there any remaining questions? Because we're pretty much out of time, and this will kind of wind things up. But yeah, we've got a question here before we get to the very end.
You mentioned some syncretism. I was wondering, do these people have a patron saint or anything like that that you know?
They do, and I mean but I don't know if it is the Buscador de los Peligros. They certainly have the festival named that way, but I know that they embrace the patron saints of the community that are being celebrated, but I'm not sure if they have one who's actually a Muxe. That would be an interesting. I was telling somebody at the other break about Santa Muerte, that the narco gangs worship the Holy Death, but it's a woman. And this is a new saint that they've kind of, created for the sake of kind of giving them courage in the face of their worldview. So I imagine the Muxes might have a Muxe saint. So Fernanda, this is the trailer from this, The Secret of the River, if you'd like to see this series. I guess it is on Netflix, which is good, because I think more people have Netflix. Let's see this.
Manuel.
Villagachi. Eso significa secreto. Este es nuestro secreto.
La vida es cabrona, hijo. No se puede ir en contra de la naturaleza.
Paulina, mi mamá me dijo que tu papá estaba investigando gente. ¿Encontraron algo más?
Hija, tuve que regresar.
¿Qué pasa? Salgo conmigo. Y me da miedo que cuando lo sepas, ya no quieras ser mi amigo.
Si de verdad es tu amigo, tiene que verte por lo que eres.
Paulina está casada con Eric.
Eric y yo queremos encargar un bebé. ¿Qué pasa, Eric? ¿No me reconoces?
¿Manuel?
Me llamo Ricardo. Ay, qué bonito nombre. Han pasado 20 años, yo también he cambiado mucho.
Algo raro está pasando.
A veces el pasado te puede chingar.
Nos van a cachar. Entonces no se lo vamos a decir nunca a nadie.
I encourage you to watch that because it's well researched, and they're authentic actors too, Muxe actors, and that's good to see. It's good to see. So, well, we've been on a journey through a number of centuries and a number of factors, and it's kind of a wild ride. Somebody came up to me at the break and said, "There's so many layers. You can just keep looking at a different angle of these things and how they all intersect." But I hope it's been helpful this week, and we'll look forward to seeing some of you Saturday. I do encourage you next week. Carlos will have a lot to say about some wonderful issues, and you can also ask him questions from this week and put them on the spot. So, Dee Dee, did you have any final closing?
I just wanted to say thank you very much. You've been fabulous.
Thank you.
And Dan has a break tomorrow, but he'll be right on again on Saturday.
Yeah.
And so bring your questions. And does everybody know does everybody know the menu and how that's working on Saturday at the luncheon? I think you've all chosen what you want.
Yeah.
Good. It's at 12 o'clock at Muxe.
Oh, yeah.
That would be a good restaurant.
Please
The
dress for the
Muxe
occasion.
Dress any way you want. It's at Mannix at 12 o'clock. Okay, so I hope to see all of you there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, Larry?
Larry.
And I wanted to thank my lovely wife,
Yeah.
Dee Dee Camhi. It's her birthday today.
Oh, yay, birthday girl. And let's also thank Fernanda again for a lot of hard work this week. But thank you, Fernanda. And Matt for hosting us. And I hope you'll all be here next week as well, okay? Thanks.